So if you want to use the chat facility to say who you are and where you're from, that would be great. We are going to be running a poll as we normally do on a Friday and using slido.com. So for those of you unfamiliar, you can get Slido one of two ways. You can either go to slido.com and enter today's code, which will be LM240921, or you can scan the QR code in there, and that will take you to a poll that I'm going to run through in a moment. We will also be using Slido today for questions and answers. So if you have any questions for Chris, I'd appreciate if you could put it into the Slido Q&A, and we will ensure they get asked. Secondly, if you think one of the questions or any of the questions are things that you would perhaps ask yourself, you can vote for them by pushing the thumbs up button, and that question will come up towards the top. So the more of you choose that question, the more that will come out at the top. Finally, we will also be running an exit poll today. We try to do this on every occasion to get feedback so that we can learn as to what we can do to change or improve. So please do take that. We normally put it up at about 10 to 1. We aim to finish sharp at 1, and we do leave the poll open so that you do have a few minutes to answer it. The poll is short, takes a minute, but we do welcome that. So what I'm going to do, I think, is perhaps now start the poll. So Abraham, if you want to bring the poll up. Now, we've only got 2 questions, but you have multiple choices with the actual answers you choose. So the first question we have, are you a client of the construction sector, a buyer working in a construction business, a supplier to the construction sector, interested in what makes clients or buyers tick, a sustainability professional, otherwise just interested? So if you could choose one of those, and you'll see that on the top, we actually have numbers of people who are answered the question, but we don't get the total number to both questions are answered. So I'll just give people a little longer to answer that question before moving on to the next one. Okay, Abraham, so if you want to put the second question up. Your role in terms of sustainable procurement, how would you best describe your role? I need things others in my organization buy for me. I am a procurement specialist or buyer who is responsible for doing the buying. I'm a policymaker or manager who influences how we buy. My role relates to sustainability, and I'm keen to improve procurement. And then something else. Something else we don't define, but please, if that is you, choose that. I'm just going to leave it up for a little bit longer. We've got about 15 people. We got just sort of nearing 50 in the room, so it'd be quite nice if we could get a little bit more feedback from others, because it really does help us to certainly helps Chris to understand the knowledge is in the room. He said to me beforehand, he's really quite worried about a sustainability expert or professional. So if you're out there, get ready with your questions. Okay, we've got a good representative of questions. Please do carry on as we go through this, because you'll see as we go back to the poll, it will change if you feed things in. So let's go back now to the first question, Abraham, please, and let's run through the answers. So otherwise just interested. So third of the room, otherwise just interested. You do have a 25% of people who say they're a sustainability professional, Chris. So that your fear is actually being realized.
No, it's great.
Have we got any at the bottom there if we roll it down a bit, Abraham? Have we got anything else? No, that's it. Okay. Would you like to make any comments on that, Chris?
No, I was only kidding about sustainability professionals. I said beforehand to Howard, my worst nightmare is someone who comes on who knows far more than I do, and I look like a muppet. But I think I've got something to tell you anyway, whatever happens. But, no, it's a good mixture, and it's nice to see people represented across the kind of the value chain in construction there. So we've got clients, we've got buyers, and we've got suppliers there, which is what I hoped to have a conversation about, that vertical dynamic. So it's great.
And the numbers have changed a bit because people have continued, so it's diluted a little bit on the sustainability professionals. So let's go to the second question then. Interesting. In terms of sustainable procurement, how would you best describe your role? Well, almost a third of people, their role relates to sustainability, but also a third something else. So I think we've probably got some first-time learners. And I have to say, I would have to put myself into that category. So I'm all ears. Interesting, I'm a procurement specialist buyer who is responsible for doing the buying, only 4%. So that's quite low. Anything you'd like to say, Chris? Because I'm going to hand over to you in a minute.
No, not at all. I think that's it's a good mix. I mean, I'm going to put myself, and I did put myself in the middle category. So I suppose I'm a policymaker or manager who influences how we buy. I'm also responsible for sustainability, so I could have picked the first one, but my role as a policymaker is probably more important at Scape in this discussion today. But everybody, the part of the reason for putting that question there up is because everybody and everybody's role has something to contribute. And I think it's useful for everyone to get perspectives on that. So I'm just keen to have a mixed audience. It's good fun. You tend to get more interesting questions when you've got different people as well. So
absolutely. So I'm going to now hand over to, so Chris, you're welcome to carry on. And certainly many thanks for coming today. And certainly I'd like to understand a bit more about Scape and what it does, etc. as well. So thanks very much. I'm going to hand over to you now, Chris. So thank you.
Thanks, Howard. Just do the thing we've all got used to waiting for.
Ah, yes. It's fine. It's come up. So over to you.
You can see that, okay. Just check that's going to move. Yeah, excellent. Right. So I'll just start with very briefly myself. So I'm a public sector professional, I suppose, by background. I did environmental biology at university. The environment's my passion, but I've been a public sector professional for 20 plus years now. I worked in local government for 14 years before going to Scape. That work has covered organisational change, service improvement, and I was capital and energy manager at Leicestershire County Council for a number of years. At Scape, my role's performance and improvement, so I do look after the sustainability brief for Scape. That covers environment, social value, and also performance measurement. But I also head up transformation at the business, so continuous improvement, which is a nice mixture. When you get the slides, my links are on there if anybody wants to make contact afterwards. If any of this floats your boat, I'd love to talk to you more in the future. In terms of Scape, the first point to say, we're a procurement organisation, and it's what we do. It's all we do. And we only do procurement in the built environment. So we don't do anything in terms of commodity purchasing, materials purchasing. We buy construction, civil engineering, and consultancy for the public sector. And that's our fundamental purpose. And we were created for that reason. So we're a public sector contracting authority, and we're owned by 6 local authorities who created Scape to do that job for them. So that's why we're here. In terms of scale, so we've been that kind of organisation for 15 years. We have nearly 200 employees directly employed by Scape, or we have 2 subsidiaries which operate in specific areas. More than 1,000 public sector organisations have worked with Scape. The number of active clients at any one time is 500 to 600, depending on where we are. So that's 500 or 600 public sector organisations that work with us for that procurement. And typically somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 live projects and commissions. So that's everything from a very small amount of consultancy advice through to £300 million construction projects and everything in between. More than 12,000 completed projects for the public sector. So we've been doing this quite a long time, and we've ended up being quite large because clients seem to like what we do. But we're not naive. Things change and move. And actually, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of procurement for sustainability is where the future of what we do is, and it's really important to us. So this subject is our forward plan, if you like. It's absolutely crucial to what Scape will be doing in the future. And I guess the big part, which I'm going to touch on a bit more in terms of our responsibility at Scape, is the scale of the purchasing power. So we procure framework agreements which allow the public sector to deliver projects and advice without doing further procurement, so they can access suppliers immediately. They don't have to go through the public contracting process, which can take quite a lot of time. And the collective value of our framework agreements is about £18 billion across the UK, which is an awful lot of purchasing responsibility. You could call it purchasing power. I see it as a moral responsibility to try to do it as well as we can, as sustainably as we can. So that's who we are and what we are. We work with, in terms of our supply chain, we work with most of the UK's top contracting organisations. So Balfour Beatty, Wilmot Dixon, Kier, and many, many more. So that's the space that we work in. So it tends to be the larger organisations, but we do some regional procurement in the Midlands for, we have a regional framework that covers the Central and East Midlands. And we work with sort of mid-size principal contractors on that framework, as well as a range of consultants. So that's Scape and what we do. Before we talk about any specifics, I just wanted to put a question there, which is what do you value from procurement? What is it that you value when you're making buying decisions? Where do you start from? And I give you 4 things to think about in that space. One is the wallet, the money, how much do things cost? And of course, that's what people traditionally think about when they think about procurement, is how much are things going to cost and how can I get things in a cost-effective way. But what we do at Scape is we value value in all its forms when we do procurement. So our construction procurement, for example, is 80% leaning towards value rather than cost in the procurement process. And when we talk about value, we're selecting for environmental sustainability and environmental management considerations. We're considering jobs and skills and employment and valuing the person. When money is spent in the public sector, how does it value the people in the communities that are providing taxpayer revenue in the first place? And also, how does it provide social value to the community? And that is the value around the community's sustainability, the community's well-being, and that you could present that in an entirely different way, which is using the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that would give you the same blend of things. But there's a really good model, which if anyone's not come across it, I would suggest you have a look, Google it after and have a look, which is the 4 capitals model, or if you Google the Capitals Coalition, and you can find out more about how balancing value is important to the public sector and to the procurement sector in general in the future, in terms of making decisions based on the outcomes that the expenditure creates in communities, corporate social responsibility, if you like, not just how much things cost. And that is embodied in the construction playbook that the government's published, but it's been embodied at Scape for 15 years. It was part of the reason why we were created as an organisation. And we have to start with this question, because if we can't articulate what we value, everything else that follows is simply a moment in time in terms of getting the cheapest or whatever else you determine to make a decision on. But if you consider what you value first, then you're going to start to formulate procurement and buying processes that take these things into account as you take them forward. And we'll start with an example, which I'm going to talk about carbon quite a bit in this presentation, simply because carbon is quite empirical and it's quite easy to talk about. And I think the world has got its head around the fact that our carbon emissions are having a substantial impact on the climate. It's interesting to watch the BBC News, to read the papers now, and it isn't a question of if, it's when. It's not a question of do we cause harm, but how much harm. And so I think that's uncontested now, or at least largely uncontested in the public space. So in terms of regulation, we're all driven by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which goes back to the Paris Climate Agreement struck at the UN internationally. And our carbon emissions as organisations, whether you're a public sector local authority or a small business, our carbon emissions are in law defined across 3 scopes. Scope 1, broadly what you do as an organisation, so the mileage you cover and the processes that you undertake as an organisation internally, and the emissions that you create directly. So if you're a contractor, that means the emissions that come from the vehicles that you're running or the plant that you're running on site, the mileage that you're carrying in your workplace cars, and the emissions coming from those vehicles. That's scope 1. Scope 2 is the energy you use in the undertaking of your activities as an organisation. So that's how green the grid is fundamentally, how many kilowatt hours of energy I use, and how much of that is coming from sustainable versus unsustainable places. And of course, you do have an influence on scope 2 because you can choose to buy greener energy. So that's the stuff that you're directly in control of. Scope 3 is everything you buy. And it is the emissions associated with producing the things that you're buying. And that's enormous. And it's where procurement becomes absolutely critical in sustainability when you talk about carbon emissions. I could pick another topic, so I could pick habitat, biodiversity, and we could have a similar conversation about how does your business affect habitats and biodiversity around your premises or around your operational base. How does the energy you consume, or how does the necessary services to run your organization affect natural habitats and the natural world? And then how are the products and services you purchase affecting the natural world? So you can take this same lens and look at it in the same way. And this is embedded in sustainable procurement best practice, these principles. So we're going to concentrate on scope 3 here because it's the carbon emissions impact. And it's really important for us to understand how big that is. So this is a slide that I've pinched from Climate Intelligence, and when I send the copy of the slides and publish them, I'll put the reference on the bottom. The iceberg reference is really useful because it's typical in terms of the balance between your carbon emissions as an organisation from scopes 1 and 2, the things you do, and the carbon emissions that come from scope 3 from your supply chain. And this is 100% typical. It's not a particularly stereotypical thing to say that that's the case. Different industries vary a bit in terms of the proportions, but ultimately there's far more below the waterline than above it. So your procurement responsibilities for carbon emissions are colossal. And if you actually want to do something about it, you can't hide from procurement responsibilities as a huge influencer on sustainability. It's worth thinking about this not just as a business, but as a person. I can do things myself at home. The lights are off. Yeah, the thermostat's turned down. I choose personally not to eat beef and lamb anymore because I know the carbon emissions associated with farming and the practices internationally are quite devastating. So I've made a conscious decision, and that's something we all have in our hands as people. Our scope 3 emissions as people are just as bad. The products you buy from the shelf in Tesco are where most of your carbon footprint lies. The petrol you put in your car, the holidays you choose to buy, it's your purchases that drive carbon emissions from your personal life as well. And as a country, we've all seen in the last 2 years the impact that our purchasing behaviours have on the rest of the world. So we've all seen plastic pollution in the Far East and the Middle East coming from our recycling behaviours and the recycling solutions that we choose to buy as a country. And some of the waste that's ending up on foreign shores comes from public sector purchasing and public sector recycling schemes. It's not rogue individuals. Our country has just as big an impact above and below the waterline as we do as people, but more importantly for us here at work, our companies. So that's why buying behaviours are so important in carbon, and it's just as applicable in other areas. So giving you a bit of context for SCAPE, as an organisation, we're an administrative business. We do procurement, which is basically pushing paper and talking to people. There is not a lot more to it. So we run an office and we do business travel, and that forms our carbon footprint. And we produced 96 tonnes of carbon in 2019. Interestingly, in 2020, we only produced 16 tonnes of carbon because we didn't go anywhere. The pandemic has had some really positive effects in that space, at least for a short period of time. But 96 tonnes sounds like a lot. However, when we consider scope 3 emissions, scope has in the last few years at times accounted for 3% of construction turnover in the UK in terms of the procurement route for the public sector. That's a big share. The construction sector in the UK is responsible for 13 million tonnes of carbon emissions annually. So when we take scope 1 and 2 emissions, it looks like this. Our scope 3 emissions, if we were to take direct and attributable responsibility for them, and it's not as simple as that for scope, because we are the provider of a solution that other people procure their projects through, so that it's arguable whether or not these are our emissions. But I personally, as director on this, like to think that they are our emissions because it helps drive our behaviours as a business. So our scope 3 emissions at Scape are 3,800 times larger than our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So our iceberg is a blinking funny shape, but we are a thimble full of sand in a bag of builder's sand. So that's a 1 ton bag of sand. We're a thimble full of sand in that bag. So our procurement responsibility is colossal. So this is our roadmap, if you like. This is how we've chosen to take things forward to address sustainability in our procurement. And it starts with policy. I'll talk a bit more about why we use policy and how we use it in a minute. We have said we've got to take responsibility for what we can control. So scope 1 and 2, we've got an action plan. We're a Nottingham-based business. Nottingham City will be carbon neutral by 2028, and we take that responsibility seriously as an organisation owned in part by Nottingham City Council, but also being from there. So we're going to be net zero by 2028. But what we've said is our procurement processes need to deliver solutions for clients who want to act on the climate emergency. So we've said our procurement must be as sustainable as we can get it. So we've taken that deadly serious, and this is our sustainability strategy. It's not just a procurement strategy, but because we're a procurement organisation, procurement features as item 3. Ultimately then, sustainability is business for us, so positioning is crucial. So we will be sharing this journey and sharing all of this information with our customers and our contractors who work for us, because it is who we are. But it doesn't stop there, because procurement is just the start for us, and procurement doesn't stop with the award of a contract for us. So we have to ensure that our people and the people who work with us are competent and capable of using the tools we create. So training is crucial, preparing our people. And ultimately, we can't stop working on this just because we've procured something. So for us, procurement is continuous improvement. So it's a fast-moving landscape, and we will just keep working on perfecting this. It doesn't stop with the day we award a contract. So that's our roadmap in simple terms. So we started with policy, and our policy has been to say, as an organisation, we will get to net zero by 2028. But our policy is also to enable net zero design and net zero construction in the projects that we facilitate through our procurement. And we've said that for clients who want that option, we're enabling that by next year. So the procurement we're doing now is designed to give clients access to contractors who can do net zero construction next year. And that follows UK Green Building Council guidance, and it follows the considerations of lots of professional bodies about the right roadmap for construction in the UK. And back to back with that policy, we developed standards that once we've done our procurement and created these contracts that lots of people use, we said, actually, we're going to make recommendations about how those contracts are then put into practice. So it's not just about the buying, it's about the use of what you've bought. And what we've done is we've developed a set of recommended standards, and we've set the operational targets and the things that we think people should be specifying when they go and use our contracts to deliver construction projects. Again, coming back to, if a client wants to deliver net zero buildings in their area, these are the kind of specifications that need to be put into practice when they're used. So we're trying to drive in the standards that will make the change. So in terms of what that means in practice and calling it out in a slightly more simplified way, we've started with the question, what do we want? So we've started with the idea that you need to capture your ambition in the sustainability space, and you need to have a policy that you can share with the people you're going to buy from. Because if you can't articulate what you want in sustainability terms with the marketplace, how on earth do you expect them to give it to you? And the role of buyer, especially when your carbon footprint is as big as ours. The role of buyer in driving the market is pretty important. It's the buyer who decides what the quality of the product needs to be. And if my quality requirements are sustainability requirements, then my suppliers will change their behavior and innovate. So that policy and having it published is absolutely critical if your organization wants to do procurement in a sustainable way, because how does anyone else know that's what you want? That's number one. Number two, can the suppliers you're going to work with deliver on that policy? So before you start selecting organizations that you're going to evaluate and choose between, you really have to think about the standards you expect and articulate that. So when you're getting into the procurement process and selecting a pool from which to fish, you're going to have to say, what suppliers do I want to work with and what are the standards that matter to me? So going back to our standards, we've said, actually, we want contractors who can measure carbon in construction. We want contractors whose organizations have a route to net zero as businesses. We want contractors who can measure embodied carbon, the carbon that arises from materials that they're going to use in their construction sites. So we've worked on that basis that we're not going to appoint anyone on our frameworks that can't do those things. So what we've done, we've gone out to BSI and to other organizations and said, what are the standards that set a bar that we expect? So there are, be it British standards, there are ISO standards that you can specify if you want to be true to your policy ambition. And our process for procurement, we do two stages. So we do a pre-qualification process and narrow the market, and then we select the contractors that we believe can do the job for us in the way we want it done. So the second stage for us is about how will those delivery partners do what you want? How will those suppliers get it done? And you've really got to evaluate the capability to do the things that you want. You can't just set a standard and expect it to happen, but you've got to get those partners to tell you how they're going to go and do it. And ultimately, you've got to use selection criteria that are going to drive the outcomes that you actually want. So at this point, you have to be really brave. If you want a supply chain and if you want to make the change in that supply chain, then you're going to have to actually choose a supply chain that can do it and make it very clear to the market that that's what you're going to do. That's one of the advantages of public procurement that Scape get into, is the public procurement process is rigorous and time consuming and horribly complicated. But one of its advantages is that at the start of the process, we call out, we're going to procure something and we're going to procure it like this, and we're going to require this standard of sustainability. And that's really important for the market, because by the time they're bidding, they know really clearly what we want. And for some suppliers, they might not be ready for that requirement, but they know where our bar is and next time they can be. And I think this is something as buyers we all have to be quite responsible about, is if we are expecting the world to change and for our supply chains to build their capability and to invest in better solutions that are more sustainable, we really have to articulate better the things that we're going to want and the way that we're going to select for them. You can't win a contract if you don't know what the rules of the game are. And I think we've got to do better to encourage those behaviours and to share what we want. Going back to our personal lives analogy, it's a consumer-led choice in that space. I choose which supermarket I'm going to buy my fish from. I choose that I want line caught fish from a sustainable fish farm rather than trawler caught fish. And that's a decision I can make. When you're a buyer on a procurement responsibility for a company, it's your responsibility to articulate whether you are a Whole Foods ethical farming supplier, or whether and that's what you want, or whether you're a slash and burn merchant. Ultimately, it's not a consumer market when you buy construction. You're advertising what it is you want, so it's a different way around. And I think we kind of got to put ourselves in the headspace of saying the choices we're going to get the market to make as a procurer are something we can influence. And then finally, and I've made this point, I put the plan, do, check, act cycle in the top right hand side of this slide for a reason, because procurement doesn't stop when you've done it. And by that, I mean, when you've awarded a supplier, if that's where you end your procurement practices, then you're not going to see this through. So what we do at Scape is we performance manage the suppliers that we appoint. We work with them for the whole duration of the contract. We take into account their performance and how it's working, so that the next time we procure, we step another step forward. And if you don't take ownership of what you've created and you don't follow through on the rules you started with, you're going to have a problem. In that space, if you value the natural world, but when you award your contracts, you behave commercially and you drive everything on cost, what do you think is going to happen? It's not enough to say you want these things. You have to continue to prioritize them. So when it comes to it, when you performance manage your suppliers, or perhaps if you have an arrangement where you build a framework of suppliers and you select between them for each job, whatever it may be, if you revert back to cost, if you revert back to the race to the bottom, if you don't continue to value the whole picture of what you're spending your money on, are you going to get the outcomes that you actually set out for? Is your policy going to be fulfilled? And I'll leave it there because I want to have a conversation with you. I don't want to talk any more than half an hour. So that's our approach. I've kept it simple and I've not gone into the detail. If people want to ask questions about sustainability of the specific aspects of construction and how all of this comes to be, I'll be delighted. And I know there's lots of people here who have probably got more knowledge than me, but I wanted to keep it simple and start with policy and policy action and the actual power of procurement as an influencer on the market, because I think if we don't start there, we don't see the big picture. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. We have a question that's come up on the chat. I'll read it out to you. What is the pace of change in terms of standards already that you are writing into minimum standards? Secondly, as technology and research progresses, presumably minimum standards 1 month can be 2 lakhs by 6 months later. So there's sort of 2 questions there. So you happy with that?
Absolutely. So going back to the slide on our roadmap for sustainability, one of the things we flagged up was perfecting. So it's a 6Ps roadmap, and the perfecting piece is about continuous improvement and research and development and being aware. And this is one of the things that is going to be really tough, and it's really tough in construction. And it's not just about standards, it's also about innovation. So from a standards point of view, yes, the standards will move forward. Yes, there will be regulation that keeps stepping forward. And yes, gradually the gears of regulation will move as well, and slowly the requirements in the industry will move forward. But they aren't going to move forward fast enough. And this is where we have to be quite ambitious and quite brave if we really want to see a change. So from our point of view, when we do procurements, the frameworks we create last for 4 years. So we have to be quite forward thinking and quite progressive. We can't make a decision on a standard that applies today and expect it to be perfect for 4 years' time. There are mechanisms that you can write into your contracts to allow you to ratchet the standards in your contract. But I suppose the important thing is to say, how far do you want to raise the bar on the market at the start of your contract? And that's the approach we've taken this time around, is to say, well, actually, and we spent quite a bit of time engaging some of these construction companies, and we said the roadmap to net zero in new buildings that the RIBA organisation, the Royal Institute of British Architects, they've articulated a really good pathway for the UK, which involves us designing net zero buildings consistently by 2025 and only building net zero new buildings by 2030. So that's a roadmap the industry's created. Well, we raised the bar on our market and said, actually, we want to do that next year. And the reason we did that is because we asked the market whether they were ready for it. And we asked the market what they thought we needed to do for our client base. We didn't do it because we wanted kudos to raise the bar, but we actually asked industry, are you ready? So that's a piece of important learning, really, that market engagement about the right standards is important, because there's no point setting a standard nobody can meet. But at the same time, if you want to accelerate improvement, setting standards that the whole industry want to get to is a reasonable thing to do. So Howard, I think that probably answers the question about standards. What was the second half of the question? Can you just remind me?
Sure. As technology and research progresses, presumably minimum standards 1 month can be 2 lakhs by 6 months later.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really interesting area in construction, because the standards themselves move, but equally the science is moving really, really fast. And just before we started, Howard and I were talking about concrete. and how an industry that's so dependent on concrete and steel can ever get to net zero quickly. And the truth is that there's an awful lot of innovation going on right now, and there will be products that come along in the relatively near future that see the level of amount of carbon in the buildings being created dropping dramatically. Our challenge in procurement is to find ways to stipulate standards that allow that innovation to come to the fore. So if you're thoughtful about it, there are ways to set standards and approaches that allow that innovation to come through over the life of the contract. So an example of that is that what we've done is we've said during each project, the embodied carbon, that's the carbon that comes from the construction process and the materials in the construction process, that carbon, the target for that by the client should be set at a project level on each project. So each time we buy, we make a choice. And the advantage of that is that you can ratchet that target based on what the industry is capable of. So and that's very important. And the other thing to say is that if you set targets on things that are empirical and can be solved lots of different ways, then you allow the market to innovate and change a solution underneath an outcome-based target. So I could say, I expect you to use a prescribed standard of steel. Or I could say, the embodied carbon that's in the structure of this building is targeted at this much. If you go with the latter process, over 5 years right now, the most sustainable thing to do is probably to specify a timber structure if you want a low carbon building. There are other ways, but that defaulting to something simple. But in 5 to 10 years' time, as the steel industry in Europe and hopefully in the UK catches up, decarbonizes, uses hydrogen to make steel, and uses electricity to remake steel from waste. As those processes come to the fore, the carbon footprint of steel is going to drop. If I'm asking for a specific type of steel, that's going to be obsolete quickly. But if I'm asking for a low carbon building, I can switch between materials and still solve the problem. So sometimes it's about choosing a target or a standard that is solvable in a number of ways to allow innovation and change over time. And we really do have to deal with that situation because our frameworks are 4 to 6 years long. So what's relevant now can be very different 4 or 5 years' time.
Thanks, Chris. If I could just ask people, we have got questions coming in through the chat. I am picking them up. But if you do have questions, could you please put them in the Q&A on Slido? It does enable us then to put them up on the screen so that everyone can actually have a read of them. But we have one here from Audley English. Most buyers look at turnover as most net zero will be delivered by MMC, which most companies have made losses on their balance sheet. How do you address this?
Yeah. So the MMC agenda is a very interesting one, and it's a continuum of solutions that's being defined by the most complicated ones at the minute. So what I mean by that is that a lot of people are thinking MMC means pre-manufactured buildings and whole buildings, when actually modern methods of construction is richer than that. It's a bit of a rubbish term, MMC. I'm not a big fan because it nothing's modern for very long. So I would rather talk about designing for manufacture, pre-manufactured approaches. In that space, you can be talking about a building that is wholly manufactured somewhere else, or you can be talking about buildings where smart manufacture is used to assemble parts of a building, parts of systems, or to use consistent manufacturing methods to produce a pre-designed solution out of a kit of parts. A lot of the organizations that are falling by the wayside in the MMC space at the minute are organizations that have set themselves up to build whole buildings or very large components of buildings, and they're not getting the volumetric demand coming. So it's a bit like being a company and going straight to making cars when actually there's much more demand for engines. There's much more demands for catalytic converters or steering systems. And in some ways, we're in construction, there's been an attempt to jump straight to making whole buildings in a box. And I think what the market's moving now, and there will be more subtlety over time, and we'll start to see componentized design, much more approaches where we're working like we're working construction sites as compartmentalized systems of manufacture. We're bringing pieces together. There's a lot more synergy between companies in the market. There's a lot more long-term partnering being created. And if you think about that context, another industry is quite a helpful illustration. So if you take motor vehicle manufacturer, or if you take airplane manufacturer, the supply chains there are deep long-term partnerships. There are 4 or 5 worldwide suppliers who make parts in a particular area, and they become incredibly efficient and incredibly specialized and incredibly good at making those parts. So from a sustainability perspective, we could see people making componentized systems within buildings for sections of that market in a very efficient way. We certainly in the UK, our pre-manufactured solutions market in construction is risky. It's not very diverse yet. I'm not sure if I answered the question, Howard, there.
Well, I think we'll get it. If people don't feel they get an answer, they'll ask it again, I think. So I'll move on. Does Scape have a model of minimum standards for inclusion in the ITTs?
We have, what we do is each time we go to market, we review that standard. So we have a model structure in terms of the way we do it. So we have component sections within the ITT. So we are going to have a section asking about social value. We're going to have a section on natural value. We're going to have a section on cost management and creating value from cost and cost risk. But we're not going to predefine forever what those standards are. Rather, we review them each time we go to market and update them. So we have a kind of a framework that we use, but we repopulate it with each procurement, and we almost do an R&D process going into each procurement to review those standards and update them.
Thanks very much. Martin Jones got one here. Clearly, making your requirements clear is a major factor in supplier development. But what else do you do to contribute to creating the quality of suppliers we need?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a really interesting question because there's a big chunk of answers, but there's some areas we do around performance of the economics of projects. So one of the challenges in the UK construction industry particularly is our commercial model causes problems in the supply chain. Historically, our behaviours as an industry, it's been raced to the bottom on all components in the project. Suppliers get replaced in the supply chain, and price drives everything. That's where we have been. And the problem with that model, particularly if you are repricing and repackaging components of the project each time, is if I'm an innovator, if I'm investing in creating more sustainable products, then that market for me is very intermittent and very risky for me to enter. And it's actually it's not conducive to innovation that we actually need. So there's a couple of things that Scape have done in the commercial side of our contracts to make the climate for innovation and partnering more friendly, because that's the culture that we need to create to drive that kind of behavior. So one of the things we've changed in the last round of procurement, we used to require every package on a project to have 3 prices by the main contractor, done open book. And there were stages within the project where that was necessary. So that process ensures the right market price, arguably, as some clients see it every time. But it almost certainly means substitution of suppliers on a regular basis. And what we've changed is that we now allow vertical partnering in the supply chain for our main contractors so that there can be longer term relationships formed. And the other thing we do with economics is Scape has always put fast and fair payment very high up our list of priorities. So from Scape's point of view, we're at 98.5% payment within the government fair payment charter in our supply chains, which means suppliers are getting paid within 19 days on Scape, which they don't get anywhere else in the construction industry consistently. So in our frameworks, that's right at the top of our performance management priorities. And that's crucial because cash flow in the construction industry is the only way you make enough money to reinvest in product. So from our point of view, that flow of money through the value chain is critical for success. So there are other things, but there's 2 examples for you in terms of the way we approach things to try to make sure that the economic sustainability is there for organizations.
Thanks, Chris. Just before we go on, I'm just going to say we have opened up now our feedback poll. So if any of you would please like to do that whilst we continue, it'd be greatly appreciated. And do please let questions come. You I've just read, actually, I probably should have read it before, but it came on after I just read that one out. It is Martin Jones again. He says, you are answering my earlier question in part on supporting supplier development by raising the move to outcome-based procurement. So I think the interesting thing there is outcome-based procurement. I don't want to add any more on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty fundamental from a sustainability point of view that if we're going to get what we want, we describe it, and we don't go in with the answers, we go in with the questions. And I think that's the way we approach it, is to say, as an example, we've asked our contractors to set their own targets on engagement with social enterprises, for example. So we've said, we want you to set an exacting target for yourself on how much money you spend with social enterprises on projects. The outcome is the furtherment of the social economy and the betterment of those businesses that are providing services beyond what they do as a core business. So they're reinvesting money in communities and in the environment. So the outcome we want is growth of that sector. We don't say you shall employ social enterprises that do A, B, and C. We say you must seek to improve the amount of spend with social enterprise, and it's that approach, really, and in looking for the buttons to press in going to market for the outcomes you want. I don't for a minute believe Scape have got all of that right yet, because there's too many nuances in sustainability to get it all right in one go. But here's another example. So historically, we used to measure performance on waste management in terms of reducing the amount of, so increasing the proportion of construction waste that is diverted from landfill, so recycled effectively. So we were promoting recycling rather than landfill. We've changed the outcome requirement in this framework to a reduction in the gross weight of waste coming off the site, full stop, whether it's recycled or anything else, because that driver towards recycling has served its purpose, because construction sites working on Scape are now recycling in the high 80s, 90% of what comes off the site. But we're actually not intervening above that in the waste hierarchy. We should be taking the waste out at the beginning. So what we've said is actually we're going to deal with the gross volume of waste and the weight per square meter as a measure, rather than saying you will deliver A, B, and C in recycling terms. We've moved towards, we want to see waste reduced overall. It's another example. But can you see where we're going in terms of driving behaviours? You both drive what you want and you invite radical solution if you do it that way.
Looks like we have a question that's come up through Slido now, Chris, so you can probably read this in front of you, but I'll read it out. It says, buyers buy what they are told or what they need to. Policy and strategy determines what they can do. What time frame do you have for strategies to be realised?
Yeah, really good. So our sustainability strategy is part of our long-term, we call it 369 because it's got 3-year intervals in it. But our strategic roadmap is 2030. So that's our outcome timeline, even though our frameworks pick up those policies and take them forward every 4 years, and each project makes a contribution. Our strategic outcomes are targeting 2030. And I think that's because we know that some of what we're asking for here requires massive cultural change, learning, innovation, organizational development, and none of that happens overnight. So for me, the strategy timeline, especially in construction, the whole business model around construction is driven one project at a time, with a ring-fenced set of profit and loss issues. So you have to have a strategy that encompasses tens, if not hundreds, of projects if you're going to make a difference. So that we really can't set a timeline any less than that sort of duration. So we will consider the success or failure of some of these strategies in 2030, but we are looking at 3-year intervals in terms of improvement.
I don't know if we have any more questions. Please let them come. I've got one, perhaps goes a little bit off piece, but I'll maybe come back to that because we've got aspiration versus realization key. Yeah. What does Scape see as an acceptable balance?
Are you asking me where I would be happy or organisationally? It's such a difficult question. I think the truth is, it's a little bit like haggling. You're going to go in at the start knowing the number you want to get to and setting an aspiration that exceeds that, because that's the natural way of things, that you won't get as far as you hoped. One of the things that Scape has a particular challenge with is we can be as aspirational as we like and as progressive as we like with some of this stuff, but ultimately it's individual clients or individual organizations that make decisions about the strategy on each project. So we can make recommendations about what's going to happen, and we can provide learning and support and advice and guidance, but it comes down to the political appetite, the personal appetite, the affordability for each client on each project. So for us, that's what will hold us back as much as anything else. And I suppose I think the aspiration versus realization balance is variable based on what you're talking about. So I'm really pushing in some of the areas we're working on to change things. And I think there are some areas where the aspiration has to be followed up by bold and brave performance management to make sure it comes. The important thing, I think, because there's a flip side of aspiration, which is the demotivation you get if you're too aspiring and you can't deliver. So it is very important that the dream is sold at a level that's going to be at least in part achieved. Otherwise, you lose people. Yeah. Excuse me a moment. Interesting. I'm going to answer the question that just came up in the chat. That light's not on, it's just reflecting bizarrely. I think the sun's coming through the back, but it does look like it's on. I've checked, it's not. Good shout.
Whilst we're talking of power, I mean, I live down the road from where Hinkley Point is being built. Huge, great amounts of concrete and steel being used to construct this. And I wonder, I mean, electricity is where we're all looking for, but batteries, etc., that need to be put into cars. I think people, they're not actually as user friendly as, because disposing of batteries is a horrendous sort of and filthy and very dangerous occupation.
Yeah.
So where does Scape sort of fit with electric, this rapid move towards vehicles, etc.? Are we moving too fast, do you think?
It's fascinating. So, I mean, I'll give you a bit of insight I was at a conference with Balfour Beatty yesterday. We were talking about fleet and plant in that conversation. And when you're talking about electrification, so when we're talking about carbon in construction coming from vehicles and plant, we're talking about heavy plant on construction sites. So we're talking about stuff that has to lift things and drive things and really heavy duty vehicles. And the power requirements are substantial there. So there's a twin innovation debate going on in that space between hydrogen fuel and batteries. And that debate has not been won. It's Betamax versus VHS. It's at that point where there's a real tension between the two markets. The issues around hydrogen, moving it around the country, getting it to where it will need to be, producing on a large scale, are massive. But equally, the headache with batteries is also massive. So there isn't an easy win there, Howard. And again, coming back to outcomes, what we're doing is pushing the contractors to say, we're going to look at your overall carbon outcomes coming from your construction sites, and we want you to work on that. There are some contractors who've done incredible things in this space already. Skanska are probably the market leader in pushing that agenda. They've gone a whole way towards electrification of plants on sites and buying green energy. It's a huge challenge. I think the thing we've got to be careful about is not getting browbeaten and depressed about how complicated the big solutions are, because the big solutions will come as the market for them evolves. So what we've got to do is encourage the right direction of travel that furthers those markets. So in incentivizing electrification, in encouraging low carbon electricity being used on construction sites, in pushing the agenda. I mean, Balfour Beatty have got a fascinating challenge, because there are whole stretches of and it's not a popular scheme, but there are whole stretches of the HS2 project which are tens of miles away from a road. So getting plant to the construction site is a huge logistical challenge. There's no electricity, there's no hydrogen supply. So the logistics of some of the things that we need to do are a huge challenge. So we've got to be respectful of that, and we've got to iterate, but we've also got to take the opportunities in innovation as soon as it comes. There's no other way around it. So, I mean, Howard, I think the positive thing is that at least in the electrification of vehicles, the government has taken a brave and positive stance and said, that's what we're going to do. And actually, by saying that's what we're going to do, it forces the marketplace to innovate and drive. And I think at least we've got something happening. The infrastructure is miles behind, and yeah, we're going to struggle, but it's a step.
I thought it was interesting. Extinction Rebellion get a lot of publicity from time to time, but one of the co-founders has actually done a complete flip, I was reading, and supports the development of Sizewell C, because apparently hydrogen, which is what you've just been talking about, it can be a byproduct of the whole process of nuclear generation, because you're boiling water and therefore you can whiz off hydrogen, I understand. So, I mean, do you think that would, do you think enough people understand that to recognize that as an alternative source of power for electricity, it also could generate another source of power?
The truth is no, and I don't. It's a very complicated mixture of stuff, and this is what this is one of the things about sustainability is it's not a subject matter that anyone should try to take on all of at once. It's a simple matter of saying, what do I know and what do I need to get knowledge from other people on? And this is, again, going back to procurement and outcomes. Sometimes if you don't know, the best result is simply got by asking for an outcome instead of an input. That way you ask for the innovation from somebody else. And that's a very healthy approach. And just to give you an analogy, something the construction sector and a lot of sectors need to learn from is how the public sector buys social care now. So the social care buyers have made a decision that what they want is outcomes and quality of life for people. And they're very willing to spend their money on very creative solutions sometimes. So the whole idea of the kind of user commission social care, and the idea that I'm going to create a market. If there isn't something there, I'm going to create it. So healthcare through the provision of riding for the disabled, or fitness classes, wellness prescriptions by the NHS. All of those ideas are people saying, I'm not going to get hung up on the way we do things now. I'm just going to look for an outcome. So that's a nice message to end on.
Well, just to end, we have got some feedback. I wonder whether people would just take the time in the last minute or two, and I say we will leave it open to give us feedback. There's one last question. Yesterday, a new biodiversity landscapes fund was announced by the government. Could you make any comment on that, and how will it help sustainable building?
The answer to that question is no, I haven't read it yet.
There you go.
But I will be reading it this afternoon. Thank you.
I thought that might be the case. Thanks, Chris, very much for a really informative session. If you would like to get a CPD certificate for today's session, please enter the event code at CE774 in your MyProPass account. And next week, please do not forget to join us. And all I can say is, thanks, Chris. Have a great weekend. And to everyone who joined us, don't forget to give us feedback. See you next week. Have a great weekend. Thanks very much. Bye. Thanks, Chris, very much for your time. And very interesting.
I was going to say, I'll just see what I'll hang on and see what the poll says, Howard, if that's all right for a minute.
Well, you might have to hang on to 15:15, so I will send it to you.
Oh, that'd be great.
I have to say, we normally get sort of 80s. We don't normally get any lower. It's a sort of proven model, but we still like to get feedback, and I'll certainly send it on to you. No trouble at all. If you could let us have your PowerPoint in, say, PDF form, make it simple, we'll put that up with the recording. Oh, you've got your microphone switched off.
The mic was off. The mic was off too.
Yeah, I know. But that's the sort of interesting, they weren't listening to you. All they wanted to know was the light was off.
No, but in fairness, it does look like it is. It's just the way the light bounces down the corridor.
Yeah.
No, I'll sort it for you now, Howard. I'll get it straight over to you in a minute.
And thanks very much indeed.